This is a full range electrostat, and I have to tell you, electrostatic bass is just incredible, addictive sounding, because I feel that the dipole nature of bass, especially in audio show conditions where the rooms are not really quite that good, I heard the exact same size room that I heard the Prodigio WR3 in. I went to listen to other speakers, that more traditional speakers like the fantastic PS Audio FR20, which I really always wanted to hear. And I went back to that room many, many times. And I really did like that speaker, but the bass was quite frankly a mess. Not because of the speaker, but because of the room. And in the exact same size room that the WR3s were in, there was no resonance that I could hear in the room itself. Everything was full and tight and deep. So I believe that dipole bass really reacts much, much better in your particular room than a traditional sealed box or ported woofer does. And that's a huge advantage in my book, because I'm one of these people that just really likes very, very tight, very taut bass. And I do have subwoofers, Velodyne DD10 Plus, which are great servo subwoofers. I haven't even put them in the system yet because I really want to play around with these speakers, optimize the bass, and then a few months down the road, I'll be able to integrate the subwoofers. In most rooms, I don't believe that you would actually need subwoofers for these speakers, because a more normal size room, even a large room, I think that these would really establish that kind of that room lock that you get where you really get full and deep bass. And it's a little bit harder to do in this room because it has well over 30,000 cubic feet. So that's kind of difficult for really any speaker to fill bass-wise, and especially with neighbors. But I think these speakers have really the right balance. I'm not hearing any particular room modes or suck outs. I will do a full set of frequency sweeps with REW and a calibrated microphone. So for this section, what I'm going to do is go to some notes that I took on my phone while I was listening to these speakers on some very familiar recordings. One is much more hiding in the recordings than I ever could have imagined. Each instrument is in its own space in the recording. And for any of you that have gone to Las Vegas to see the Cirque du Soleil Love Show, the Beatles extravaganza, they went back to the multi-tracks, and each speaker in the place has its own dedicated track from the original multi-tracks in the Beatles recordings. And in some ways, that's what this speaker does. It really sounds like each instrument has its own multi-track because it is so complete. There is so much information there. There is just such a wide bandwidth for each of the instruments. And again, the speakers that I had previous to this were no slouch in that department, but you can just hear into the recordings so much more than ever before. And I think that's because of a couple of reasons. And number one is the fact that there is no crossover in the signal path. And I think that that gives just an amount of information and signal purity that most other speakers don't have. And a lot of people have gone over to active crossovers because it doesn't have that passive circuitry in the crossover. But of course, there is still a lot of circuitry in that active crossover itself, and this eliminates all of that. Another note that I made was Technicolor realism. And for people that are not familiar with the film process, Technicolor was a 3-strip process where the red, green, and blue was recorded on separate strips of film. And that just was able to record a tremendous amount of information. And it's an analogy that I bring to this speaker. Speed. Of course, this being a push-pull dipole panel that is a very, very thin piece of mylar and that actually weighs less than the air surrounding it, it is able to push and pull so many times quicker than a traditional driver with a lot of mass. And these speakers are like that super quick sports car. Voices pop up in a way that I've never heard them before. So complete, so full. It's really like the singer is in the room or that you're in the environment with which the vocal was recorded. Bells and cymbals have a life of their own as you would hear them in reality. They just seem to pop up from that kind of black background. And one of the things that's also interesting is these speakers are they're just not fatiguing at all. There's just a ton of information, a ton of resolution, an incredible amount of inner detail, but they're never fatiguing. A traditional speaker falls off, I believe it's 6 dBs as you double the distance away from the speaker. A line source only drops off 3 dB. So with the TADs, as great as they were, I always felt like that there was sort of an envelope that I had to be in to get all the detail. And with these speakers, that envelope is much, much further away, and you can listen either further or closer, but I feel like the line source is very, very advantageous. Let's talk about value for money. Of course, these are expensive speakers, but if you had to pay for a huge cabinet behind this size speaker, I mean, these speakers would probably be double to triple in price because you have to design a huge cabinet. You have to have the internal bracing for it. You have to finish that much more material. And so I think that Electrostats are really good values because you're only paying for the frame and the panel itself, not the huge cabinet behind it. And as most people know, the cabinet is one of the biggest costs in speaker production. Another note is easy to hear the room it was recorded in and any added ambience, be that electronic or from the room itself. And these are just a whole new level of hearing the ambiance in the room. And also the tracks of the recording itself. I was listening to a Rod Stewart album, an older album, and the interesting thing is that the overdubs that were recorded later just had much more fidelity than the tracks, the bass tracks that were recorded first. And my theory is that because the master tapes had to be played so many times to do the overdubs and things like that, that the tape does deteriorate over time. And so the instruments that were recorded later had very few plays on it after those instruments were recorded. And so for some reason, those later instruments really popped out of the mix a lot more so and had better fidelity and lower distortion than the rest of the tracks in the recording. The interface here between the panel and the room is just completely different than a traditional speaker where has greater excursion, but you're driving it from a very small area. This has just a tremendous amount of surface area that you're driving it with, and that really pays dividends. Another analogy is that traditional speakers throw buckets of water at you. But with these speakers, it's as if you're wading in a pool of water. So I don't know if that's a helpful analogy or not, but that's just one of the impressions that I got while listening to these versus a traditional cone speaker. Even at low volumes, these speakers are fantastic. They provide tons of details, and even like in the 50 dB range, mid 50 dB range, these still sound fantastic and give you a lot of detail and a very full sound, which is always a good thing for a speaker where you don't have to listen loud to get the feeling of fullness.